Hey guys, this video is going to be going in depth about pallets in Dead by Daylight. Now I know I already had a video about this, but I believe that pallets are the single most important thing to understand if you want to play this game at a high level. I'm going to start this video with some very basics about pallet play, and then I'm going to showcase the common pallet spawns that show up in the maps and explain how safe they are. Okay, the first thing we'll talk about is looping. To understand the idea here, there's a limited number of pallets that spawn on the map, and once they're broken, they stay gone. Because they're a limited resource, you want to make sure they get the most use out of a pallet that you can before using it or forcing it to be broken. The most common and simple way to do this is by looping. The general idea behind looping is keeping a far distance from the killer and mirroring their actions while circling the pallet and only using it when you absolutely have to in order to avoid a hit. Most pallets in the game are large loops with small walls where you can keep line of sight on the killer. This makes them extremely safe to loop, and as killer, you should never bother with switching directions as that wastes a ton of time. You want to commit to one direction and use your faster movement speed to close the gap and force the pallet drop. The idea behind looping is to conserve pallets, and the opposite play style is called pallet camping. Pallet camping is when a survivor runs to the pallet and waits until the killer gets near to drop it, without any looping or gameplay around it, and then runs to the next one. While this can sometimes be a slightly safer way to play, you'll end up flying through pallets, and it ends up creating a lot of dead zones where there's nothing to use as a survivor. This hurts your team a lot in the long run and should be avoided at all costs, especially if the killer is using a lot of stalling perks that make the game last longer, like Hex Ruin. If you're a killer and you notice a survivor is pallet camping, you can either chase them around and break the pallets as they throw them, which is great as it strips the survivors of their resources, but it also takes quite a lot of time that the survivors can use to get a lot of generators done. It's a lot better to still try to get hits, but break the pallets as they're dropped as well. A very common used counterplay if you notice a pallet camper is to fake like you're going around and get out of sight of the survivor and then swing back into the pallet. This often takes survivors off guard and you can get a lot of hits that you wouldn't normally get. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to using pallets efficiently is to not waste pallets after a hit. A lot of survivor players make the same mistake where they'll drop a pallet shortly after getting hit, even if the pallet wouldn't have been anywhere close to saving them from getting hit. This is something that's completely unnecessary, as the speed boost you get after getting hit mixed with the cooldown the killer gets is more than enough to make up a huge chunk of ground and get you to the next pallet. When playing Survivor, try to get an idea of how far away the killer needs to be for the pallet to actually prevent a hit. And in situations where you're gonna take a hit, don't panic and keep the pallet up so you can use it to help you get away later on in the chase. The next thing we're going to talk about is Pallet Respect. Respecting pallets means that as a killer, you stop when you think a survivor is going to drop a pallet to avoid the stun. This is very common at low ranks because survivors are very predictable and never try to punish it. As a survivor, if you notice the killer is always stomping at pallets or backing away from them when you're about to drop them, you could punish it by simply not dropping the pallet and continuing the loot. By the time they react to the fact that the pallet wasn't thrown, you'll already have a big enough lead to get away with another loot. Another thing similar to respect that you can punish is swinging too early. If you notice the killer is going for a particularly ambitious swing while looping, you can take advantage of the slowdown from the missed hit and get away with another loop. Don't try to do this if the killer has bloodlust though, or if the loop is particularly big, as it only saves a small amount of time. This strategy can be very risky though. If you assume the killer is going to respect the pallet and they don't, you're basically giving away a free hit or maybe even a down. It's probably best to wait until you play a couple pallets with the killer first to see what they do before trying to punish the respect. When done correctly, this can add a lot of time to chases and really help with pallet efficiency. Keep in mind that everything in this game is about using your time effectively, so wasting another 5 or so seconds of the killer's time might not seem like a big deal at first, but if you continue to do so throughout the game, it adds up and you'll end up with a much easier escape in the long run. It's also just generally pretty fun to outplay a killer in this way, and it can usually end up in some pretty good laughs if you can manage to do it. Now I bet it's pretty obvious what I'm going to tell you to do as killer. You should almost never be respecting pallets. Eating the stun is not that detrimental and it ensures that the drop is forced. The perk Enduring makes this even better as it cuts down the duration of the stun to something like half a second and it's almost not even noticeable. At high ranks, you'll find a lot of survivors looking to punish respect, and you can get a lot of free hits by just barreling through pallets as if they weren't even there. Keep in mind that I did say almost never respect them. It can sometimes be good to switch up your gameplay if you can tell the survivor is trying to predict you. Pretending to respect pallets a few times might bait a survivor into trying to punish it, but this is risky and advanced and needs to be practiced for it to be worthwhile. The safest bet is just to pretend they aren't there and eat the stuns. Something that's really important to know when swinging through pallets is how the swing actually works. Obviously, you probably already know that holding down the swing will cause you to lunge, but this actually makes the hit register later in the swing. If you just slightly tap the swing when you're swinging through a pallet from very close range, your hit will actually register slightly sooner, and you can sometimes squeeze in cheeky hits that you normally wouldn't be able to get. This doesn't always work, and it's very situational because the range of the swing is very short, but practicing this can help out a lot. Okay, now we're getting to probably the most important part of this video, pallet safety. When someone talks about how safe a pallet is, they're basically describing how easy or hard it is to play the pallet without getting hit. An extremely safe pallet is a pallet where, unless you majorly misplay a survivor, you won't get hit before or after the pallet drop, and the killer is forced to kick the pallet or they'll waste time trying to get a hit that is impossible. The ability to identify a pallet safety is one of the most important things when it comes to chases in Dead by Daylight. As a survivor, you need to know whether a pallet is safe enough for you to stay and force a kick, or if it's unsafe and you need to get to the next one as fast as possible. Likewise, as killer, you need to know which pallets are too safe to play around and know to immediately kick them to save time. And also which pallets are unsafe, or at least semi-unsafe, or you might be able to avoid kicking to get a hit. So how do you determine how safe a pallet is? Well, all pallets are between two structures, and the size and shape of those structures is what determines the safety. If the sides of the pallet are big enough that the killer can't effectively get from one side of the pallet to the other, but also not so big that they'll catch up while looping, then it's a safe pallet. Keep in mind that when a pallet has one side that's bigger than the other, you can actually control which side you play on as survivor. If they try to run around the smaller side, loop the big side and force them to chase you around. If they try to play the big side, simply stay at the pallet and vault when they get close. As long as it's played correctly, the killer won't be able to get a hit and will be forced to kick the pallet, and you can move on to the next one. As killer, it's important to identify pallet safety and know whether or not it's worth the time to try to play it. A pallet that's extremely safe will be a huge waste of time if you spend any time trying to force a hit, and you'll eventually have to give up and break it anyways. Choosing your battles and knowing which pallets to immediately break will help save you a lot of time in the long run. There's also some pallets on the maps that are very unsafe. An unsafe pallet has very small sides to them, and it's extremely easy for the killer to maneuver from one side of the pallet to the other. As survivor, it's a very bad idea to try to stay these pallets for longer than needed, and you should immediately be looking for a safe way to the next pallet or window. As killer, you absolutely do not want to kick these pallets in a chase. These are the spots on the map that you want to get to in a chase so you can take advantage and get hits. If you take the time to kick one of these mid-chase, the survivor will be able to easily make it to the next pallet that'll most likely be much safer, and you'll lose the chance to get the hit that you could have gotten. Instead, mind game the pallet, and as long as you predict semi-correctly, it should end up in an easy hit. Luckily, most of the pallets in the game fall somewhere in between these two. I'll call these semi-safe pallets. If the survivor plays these pallets perfectly, it's very hard to almost impossible to get a hit as killer. But likewise, if they make even a small mistake, you can manage to get a hit as killer. These pallets make up the majority of pallet tiles that can spawn throughout maps. Playing these pallets as survivor takes a ton of practice. Obviously, like all looping, you have to be able to keep a good eye on the killer and react to what they do. After the pallet's thrown, if the pallet is even on both sides, you can fake pallet vaults as well as trying to time your vaults correctly to counterplay. If one side of the pallet is bigger than the other, like we said before, you can force the play on that side by looping it when they go around the small side and timing your vaults correctly on the larger side. The key thing to practice here as survivor is patience. The killer will usually try to bait you into vaulting at a bad time to catch you at the other side, but as you practice, you'll learn how far the killer has to actually go before you need to vault. Try to not panic and really pay attention to how far the killer goes before you vault, and as long as you're focusing and react at the correct time, they won't be able to get a hit. Keep in mind though that this is not necessarily easy and takes a bit of practice, but if you can get good at this, you'll find yourself wasting a ton of killer's time, which can single-handedly carry your team. We can also take note that this particular pallet shown in the video is an example of a pallet that is barely safe. You have to play this almost perfectly to avoid the hit. A lot of pallets have equal sides that are strong though, and this allows for even more chance at counterplay. If both sides are decently safe, you can mix in fake vaults and loops as well as trying to time the vaults correctly. As Bloodlust builds up though, it becomes more and more dangerous, and eventually a good prediction from the killer will probably end up in a hit. As killer, playing pallets like these are a big deal. Knowing when you can get hits and when you have to give up will save you a ton of time, which can get you downs quicker, which will get the survivors off the generators to get saves, and so on and so forth. It's important to base your decision off of the survivor you're playing against. Some survivors will be very obvious that they don't even look behind them and you'll know that you don't have to kick the pallet, but some others will at least know to keep an eye on you, and they'll even try to play the pallet against you, but might not be able to do it 100% correctly. A good thing to do if you're unsure is to test a survivor. Chase them around the pallet and try a mind game or two on them, and if they easily fall for the mind games, that you know for the rest of the match that you won't need to break these semi-safe pallets against them. Likewise, if the survivor clearly is knowledgeable and knows how to play pallets correctly, you'll know to kick all semi-safe pallets against them for the rest of the match. It might even be a good idea to not chase survivors like this if they're in an area with a lot of pallets, because you'll end up stuck in a series of loops and pallet kicks until they run out. In situations like this, it's sometimes better to abandon the chase and find another survivor that'll be an easier down. Another factor for the safety of pallets is line of sight. If a pallet that barely has a size to be safe also has blocked line of sight, it might have some room for counterplay. Killers can hide their red light by moonwalking and try to be unpredictable to try to get hits on pallets like these. Keep in mind though that this only applies when the pallet is just barely big enough to be safe. A pallet that's much larger with line of sight blockers will still be extremely safe after thrown. However, line of sight blockers make pallets slightly more unsafe to loop while the pallet's still up. The killer can again moonwalk and use his red light to try to manipulate the survivor into going to a bad position and getting a hit. Knowing how far to go to show the light is very important. You want to go just far enough that they're convinced that you're committing to a direction and then switch it up. If you think that the survivor you're playing against is very skilled and will look out for the moonwalk, you could also fake the moonwalk and then go back the original direction. The lack of line of sight on the survivor side makes it very possible to keep them constantly guessing, and if they guess wrong, they'll walk right into you. Alright guys, I think that's going to be about it for pallets. This is, in my opinion, the most important thing to learn in Dead by Daylight if you want to play the game at a high level. Being able to identify strong and weak areas and using that towards your decision making will do wonders for how well you play on both sides. I'll try to do some more videos soon that'll maybe talk about what pallets can spawn exactly where on the map, so keep an eye out for that. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to sub to the channel for more similar content, and thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you later. I'll see ya.